I'd like to share some experience using a simple wrist exoskeleton, hand exoskeleton, and you have seen it in the presentation just outside. And I would also like to tell you a few words about exoskeletons that have a larger number of degrees of freedom. I mean arm exoskeletons. What's the idea of using exoskeletons for neurorehabilitation? New approaches to neurorehabilitation are based on neuroplasticity, and they're based on the fact that the brain preserves plasticity even at a relatively old age. So plastic, before it was considered that only children have plastic brains, but in fact it's not exactly true. People at all ages have a certain amount of plasticity in their brain. In the literature, there are 3 publications, and please note that they were written between the 20th and the 21st century. The experience of using this approach to neurorehabilitation and plasticity goes back less than 20 years. The first classic work that is highly cited was published by Nudo and others. They induced stroke in adult monkeys, and they showed that physical training of these monkeys not only facilitated the recovery of motor function, but also some plastic changes in the brain that could be observed even at the level of morphology. And that was a very good basis for thinking about how do we stimulate neuroplasticity in stroke patients. Bakirita is the second publication in this list. Bakirita is known for his work with the sensory modality. He created artificial vision based on tactile stimulation. He worked in very different directions of neurophysiology, and he was the first to formulate the theoretical principles of the new approach to neurorehabilitation. The next work was written by Taub. This is an example of how neurorehabilitation can be used practically. He proposed constrained therapy. The healthy hand is fixed, let's say it's plastered over, and the person has to do all the things using the ipsilegional hand. And that's a very strong stimulation to this hand that has lost motor function. So when you fix the healthy hand and you have to do something with your paralyzed hand, that's a very efficient way of stimulating rehabilitation. What are these principles? Early start, starting from the first hours after the stroke, if there are no counterindications. Second, very high motivation of the patient to participate in this rehabilitation. Targeted training in functional and applied movements. If these movements, if some movements are functionally important, Then they recruit larger areas of the brain, and the stimulation of this plasticity in fact covers larger and larger areas of the brain. And then the use of adequate feedback so that the person sees the results of its motor efforts, intensiveness, and regularity, and the making sure that the rehabilitation environment is as close as possible to the real environment. And exoskeletons play a major role in this. The training sessions could be regular. The patient, of course, participates in these training sessions using the exoskeleton. Exoskeleton reduces the need for assistance helping the motor actions of the patient. And there are very many different exoskeletons for neurorehabilitation.
There's a growing number of publications on that, but for that you need rather complicated and complex exoskeletons. This is how we moved to the exoskeletons of two arms with all degrees of freedom. For that, from the very beginning, we have chosen a different technology to design these robots compared with regular industrial robots. Our main idea is that the exoskeleton needs to interact with a human hand in such a way that it has to be flexible enough or compliant enough. If in regular industrial exoskeletons you control individual joints, and in terms of kinematics, if there's a deviation from the pre-planned movement, there's a force that returns it to the required position. To control this exoskeleton through individual joints and motors, you need significant feedback loops. If the ratios there are down, then we get these involuntary chaotic movements, something that humans never do. And in human beings, such control goes through this full state principle. Every movement, even if it's done through one joint, impacts the position of all other joints through their mechanical interaction. And for that movement to be smooth, you need this full state control. It's hard to organize, but it can be done if you use force momentum. We use force momentum rather than kinematics. Here we show you that it's really hard to move. You cannot control it externally, and that's when the force of the momentum is zero, and this person freely moves this exoskeleton. When it equals zero, it already allows you to do various mirror technologies. When the human being moves his unaffected hand in the exoskeleton, this is interpreted, and the affected hand can repeat this movement. This is how the exoskeleton manages all 7 degrees of freedom. Every movement is individual, harmonized with all degrees of freedom, how all these links interact. And such exoskeletons are much more comfortable when the feedback ratio is similar to what is used in human hands and arms. We looked at those ratios in the feedback loop in a human arm, and let's show another video. This is the exoskeleton with 2 hands. We call it the pianist, the piano player, and this one is the violinist. And these move is the demonstration of how it can actually move. Here we need to ensure we have a set of human movements and select most important commands or different goals that they need to meet, and asking people to imagine an important command to one of our patients that we had. He was after the car crash. His right hemisphere was destroyed and the left part of the body did not function. He was the world champion in biking, and 10-12 years ago he got into a car crash. He was highly motivated. He wanted to restore movements. He could not move his left hand. We put a pyramid in front of him and asked him to reach for this pyramid. He could not make this movement. He did it like this, in clumsy movements like that, using his entire body. And then we asked him what kind of movements he wanted, and after several attempts we made a deal with him that for him, as a former athlete and a biker, a cyclist, he has to reach for the brakes on the bicycle handle. He had to imagine this movement as if he's reaching for the brakes handle, and we simulated this with this attempt, ready, steady, go, and then he couldn't do it for 12 years, and then he was a big guy, and then he could do this movement, and he wept, and it was a very touching moment. I'm saying that such exoskeletons give us excellent opportunities for rehabilitation, not just through BMI, but about 20 different technologies of rehabilitation using exoskeletons. And there are many such technologies. They may be more expensive than the wrist, but they are also quite promising.